wonderful good evening to you, one and all. Greetings and welcome to our fourth lecture within the Financial Masterclass series. Greetings, blessings, and welcome, one and all. This evening, we will be looking extensively at two very complicated subjects. The first is a consequence of a question that was put forth within the question platform from last week, and it pertains to the law of commerce and the overall concept of lawlessness. And the second pertains to the future value of money. So without further ado, let us begin the evening's lesson. If anyone is not able to see the screen that is currently being shared, please let me know so that I could make the necessary adjustments. The question that came last week, and there were several questions, by the way, I thank you one and all for your questions. As I indicated within the first lecture, we will not be able to address all questions that come forth. However, I will try to do my best to answer at least one question in every class. And this was the question that was selected from last week. And it was given to me by an attorney at law by the name of Daniel Blake. Mr. Blake, I thank you kindly for the question. And it reads as follows. It says, my question is specifically to your discussion on chapter 8 of Plato's Republic. At the top of Plato's 5 regimes is a philosopher king, and at the bottom, there is a tyrant. How do you reconcile the usage of these regimes with your statement that the law of commerce is blind to offices and titles, politics, and religion? Now, for those of you who are not attorneys at law and who are not philosophers, because I suspect that our good friend Daniel Blake is probably very much a philosopher as well. Notwithstanding, answering this question requires a discussion on the law of commerce at its highest level. For we stated very clearly that indeed the law of commerce is blind to offices and titles, politics and religion. And we also stated it weighs the equal trade of value for value, irrespective of the person or authority in the transaction, whether they are rich or poor, powerful or weak, free or enslaved. Now, to understand the reconciliation of Plato's 5 regimes, where we talk about kings, which is obviously a title, and we talk about democracy, which obviously pertains to politics. And we talk about moral obligations between leadership and the people whom those leaders represent, which obviously encompasses religion. To understand how these topics are addressed by the law of commerce, it requires understanding the first component. For we speak not only of commerce, but we speak of law, and law as it applies to commerce. And of course, by virtue of having laws, we are able to distinguish between legitimate commerce and illegitimate commerce. Indeed, it is because of law that we are able to identify theft and deception in contrast to a legitimate commercial transaction. Now, in order to have a proper appreciation of law, we must understand, and indeed, this brings us deep into the topics of politics and religion. But because this is a master class, we shall delve deep into those topics, non-apologetically, knowing that the outcome shall be the invigoration of our minds. So in order to understand the meaning of law, we must properly understand the meaning of lawlessness. Now, conventional definitions of lawlessness state a behavior that is illegal or not controlled by laws, or a lawlessness is rebellion against the law. Both of these definitions are convenient. However, they don't quite speak to the task that we have at hand. And I will present you with my preferred definition, which is a third definition that we will look at momentarily. But in order to properly understand law as it relates to Plato's discussions on the 5 regimes, I would like to create a historical context. And it's a very applicable historical context. For its origin, for those people in the Caribbean and in North America, speaks to the fundamentals under which their captivity for these last 400 years began, which was initiated under commercial objectives. And of course, it looks at the economic, political, and legal frameworks by which they were perpetuated and sustained. And so I would like to take a moment, just a digression of 1 or 2 minutes, to give some background information to our dear cousin of old, King James, who is no stranger to most of you, as I know that the King James Bible is the preferred biblical literature for many. Now, in King James's biography, his mother, Mary of Scots, was beheaded shortly after his birth. Indeed, his mother never lived beyond his first year. And for all intents and purposes, many people would have thought that that would be the end of the Scottish kingdom, because at that time there was not yet unification between Scotland and England. Notwithstanding, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I passed on her throne to King James. And it was through King James that we had the unification of Scotland and Britain. And obviously, he was the one who coined the term Great Britain. Now, looking into his biography, we all know that King James was an avid man of faith, as it were. And so if we look at his religion, which speaks to his economics, for within Plato, we see that a philosopher king sits at the head, then we would see that obviously his role model would be one Lord Jesus Christ. And the law that he would have wanted to espouse from Jesus would, for all intents and purposes, read as such. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, that would be the doctrine, or the gospel, as it were, that King James would have married himself to and would have wanted to fashion his economy after. And indeed, he took it a step further. What most of you don't know is that in addition to authorizing the rewriting of the Bible, King James was a, how shall we say, avid demonologist. And in his argumentations, he wrote a work called Demonology, which is often called How to Make a Pact with the Devil. And within the opening preamble to this work, which was written in 1597, prior to the authorization of the King James Bible, King James is qualifying why he is writing on this topic. And he writes as follows. He says, "Not only are the assaults of Satan most certainly practiced, but those in league with him deserve the most severe punishment. I say this against the damnable opinions of two groups of people in our age, one being the Scotsmen and the other being the Englishmen, both of whom are not ashamed to write in public papers that witchcraft doesn't exist, and by so doing, denying the power of Satan through witchcraft. They maintain the same old mistake of the Sadducees in the denying of spirits." So ultimately, what King James was arguing was that if you deny the influence of Satan within the economy and within the society, you are effectively denying the entire foundations upon which your spiritual faith is built upon. And consequently, he went through great efforts to study and understand witches, warlocks, and all things pertaining to that topic. And indeed, in the same year that he wrote Demonology, that was the beginning of what they called the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1597, in which time approximately 400 people were put on trial for practicing witchcraft, and indeed more than 200 men and women were ritualistically beheaded, hung, and burnt at the stake by the courts of King James. And indeed, James was so obsessed with hearing the confessions of witches that he would often personally participate in the interrogation of witches and other possessed people. And indeed, during one of his journeys to the mainland in Denmark, or Holland rather, he heard a confession by a witch who spoke directly to him. And she told him things that happened in his life that made him say, except that she were possessed, she could not know what she said, because what she said was 100% true. So in any case, witch hunts became a major part of his foundations, a major part of the kingdom of Christ that he wanted to establish. And indeed, within his writings, as we stated last week, King James was the last European market to fully embrace the ancient tradition of the divine right of kings. And indeed, he said, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they are called. They are called gods. And so it is in that spirit and in that state of mind, perceiving himself as a philosopher king and the representative of God Almighty on earth, that in 1606, he of course wrote, authorized, and sealed the first Virginia Charter, being the first colony of Great Britain in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, and as such, the birth of America as we know it. And within the charter, I would like to take a moment to read these lines because it's highly applicable to addressing the question of our attorney at law, Mr. Blake. So please bear with me as I read the opening passage from the First Virginia Charter. It reads as follows. James, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and other such titles. Whereas our loving and well-disposed subjects have been humble suitors unto us, that we would vouchsafe unto them our license to make habitation, plantation, and to deduce a colony of sundry of our people into that part of America commonly called Virginia, and other parts and territories in America. We greatly commending and graciously accepting of their desires for the furtherance of so noble a work, which may, by the providence of Almighty God, hereafter tend to the glory of his divine majesty in propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. Do by these our letters patents graciously accept of and agree to their humble and well-intended desires. King James, in the First Virginia Charter. Now, the name Virginia was inspired by, of course, Queen Elizabeth I, who was the Virgin Queen. And so in naming the colony in America, Virginia, it spoke to a very symbolic new beginning, almost a type of divine conception in which a new era of wealth and prosperity and good living under a settled and quiet government would be established. Now, the intentions may speak to something pure and true, but we come to understand that shortly after 1606, in addition to the wholesale murder of indigenous Americans and the theft of their land, which the Charter of Virginia constituted. In 1619, the throne of King James became participants in the enslavement of Africans. Now, to understand the application of this as it relates to lawlessness, I want to bring you back to our starting point so that we can clearly see how Plato's 5 regimes, going from the philosopher king to timocracy, to the oligarchs, to democracy, and eventually ending up in tyranny. How Plato's 5 regimes each speak to, at its highest level, full law, and then going through each level, a deterioration of the law. So King James's starting point was to follow a new commandment, one in which he is commanded to love one another. And in pursuit of that divine commandment, he finds himself murdering more than 200 men and women, ritualistically beheading them, burning them at the stake, apparently for witchcraft. And that is supposed to be an official record of his pursuit for divine love and justice. And then he follows that act. Perhaps it began here with his obsession with the whispers of witches, as it were, and his obsession with trying to prove the existence of Satan. We know not, but we can only explore. For he continues, in addition to stealing the land, to abducting Africans and enslaving them. All of this in the name of Lord Jesus Christ. And so what we see is a foundation built upon lawlessness. For if this commandment is to be the law that is to be held up in the light by which all things, great and small, are judged, then certainly everything that he does thereafter is a deterioration of the law. And it continues from 1619 right up until present day, so that we are able to speak of 400 years of captivity and affliction. And indeed, we recognize that most recently, the very badge of honor which Lieutenant Elizabeth II, in her office as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, bestows on her lead ambassadors, on her key governors, is a badge which, on the one hand, within its official description, is supposed to depict Saint Michael as an archangel standing on the back and on the head of Satan. And of course, in this depiction of a divine angel standing on Satan, what common eyes and what lay eyes actually see is a white man standing on the head of a black man. And indeed, this very badge raised such offense at the time of the murder of George Floyd, because it inspired the drawing of similarities and commonalities. It raised such controversy that indeed the Governor General of Jamaica indicated that he would no longer wear the badge. And the Queen was requested to formally have that badge changed. Now, the only reason why 400 years later, this badge could still be an issue and could still be problematic to the hearts and minds of people is because the foundations were built upon lawlessness. And indeed, we see that the Bible is still used to promote financial and economic lawlessness, political lawlessness, social lawlessness, and spiritual lawlessness. And it is not only within America, in terms of North America, for the captivity also found its way into South America under the authorization of Pope Nicholas. And that lawlessness from the Vatican has persisted unto this very day. Indeed, we see that every pope who also bears the title, the Vicar of Christ, every pope from 1452 until this very day has had the opportunity to rescind the lawless papal bulls, in particular, Dum and Diversis, as well as Inter Carrera, which laid the foundations for the so-called doctrine of discovery. However, despite pleas from the indigenous community to have those papal bulls rescinded, even most recently to our dear Pope Francis, while he has recognized the atrocities of the doctrine, he has refused to rescind the doctrines. As a vicar of Christ, that is what one would call the spirit of lawlessness. And it is no different for those indigenous communities that plead in Canada or in the US with the Queen of England, or rather the government of Great Britain, for some sort of reparations for lands that have been illegitimately taken. And rather than legitimately addressing those requests as a good lieutenant before the throne, those requests are ignored. And as such, the spirit of lawlessness persists. And it's not merely to identify Great Britain or to poke fingers. We're actually using real examples to understand the relevance of Plato's 5 regimes and the deterioration from a state of godliness to lawlessness. For both within Great Britain and within the Vatican, while they called the indigenous people savages, and while they formally identified their objectives as being the spiritual transformation of those peoples, what we recognize and what we identify is the core intention, always has been the pursuit of gold, diamonds, gems, rubies, sapphires, bauxite, and other precious commodities. And all of this is in the spirit of lawlessness. Now, in parallel times, we have seen counterpoint examples that speak even to the doctrine, as it were, of Christ. We've seen that when Mansa Musa went on his Hajj to Mecca in 1324, he freely distributed such quantity and quality of gold amongst the people that the price of gold dropped for 10 years. And so we understand that there are historically, while some kings were plotting on how to steal indigenous lands, there were other kings who were outperforming their spiritual duty. And we also see that during the lifetime of our good sir, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he had a dream of peace and racial harmony at a time when the administration of the USA still had an agenda of brutality and racial war. So the aspiration for peace, the intention for peace has always been there, but others have preferred the spirit of lawlessness and the economics of lawlessness. And so, starting with Plato's top regime, the philosopher king, to answer the question of our good sir Daniel Blake, the application of the law of commerce is consistent throughout. It doesn't change if we talk about politics. It doesn't change if we talk about religion. It doesn't change if we talk about economics. For a proper law is a law that is consistent throughout all time. And if it's not consistent throughout all time, then be assured it is no law at all. And indeed, to give a more current and immediate example as it pertains to our economy and lawlessness, we see that the international community, and I don't want to delve too deep in this topic at the moment, but we see that the international community is making a move towards the mandatory injections of a vaccine amongst the people of our good planet. And we see an increasing system of apartheid taking place, in which those people who refuse to receive the vaccine will not be admitted to basic public services such as the bus. They will not be admitted to grocery stores. They will not be admitted to all of those places in public which they otherwise would be admitted to. Now, from a legal context, in the spirit of the law of commerce, we need not have a discussion on what anybody thinks about the vaccine. The simple fact of the matter is that if there is a healthy person who is standing before you, and you are neglecting to allow that healthy, normal person to participate in society, for no other reason than the fact that they do not have a vaccine. And let me not delve into the pandemic topic, for no other reason than the fact that they do not have a vaccine, then you are engaging in a system of apartheid. And it is a system of apartheid that is perhaps the worst type of apartheid one could ever conceive of. For in the past, we've seen apartheid, which was based upon mental perversion, apartheid that divided Black and white, apartheid of racial discrimination. And now we see an apartheid of economics, because the vaccine is a commercial product. It doesn't matter that it is a commercial product used for medical purposes. We will come to the medical component of it in a moment, but it is nevertheless a commercial product. It is transacted in exchange for monetary value. And at the core of the law of mandatory vaccination is a statement that says, if you do not have this product within your body, then you will be obliged to not participate in society. And that is not only apartheid, but that is lawlessness at its highest order. Now, from a medical perspective and from the savings of life, of course, every individual must be free to make their own choice. But in terms of mandatory impositions, if the concern is about saving lives, then it should be known that indeed the COVID pandemic is taking 7 lives every single minute. But right beside the COVID pandemic is starvation. And indeed, death by starvation is claiming 12 lives per minute. And while the COVID as a product has been successful in making lawmakers lazy to pass lawless laws, starvation has done little more than get us Christmas songs, jingles that remind the world to feed the world. But indeed, although 12 lives are being taken every minute through starvation, we do not see the spirit of activism. We do not see any effort to pause the economy, to accommodate the needs of the poor, the needs of those who are starving. And so I give you a new definition and a proper definition of lawlessness so that we can understand it most appropriately as it pertains to Plato's 5 regimes and as it relates to the law of commerce. Lawlessness imitates the behavior of law until over time it becomes so abundant and common that one imagines lawlessness is the law. And lies are imposed upon us as the truth. That is the nature of lawlessness. And while we used examples today that applied to Great Britain and to the Vatican, we could have just as easily applied it to Russia and their incursion in the Ukraine. We could have just as easily applied it to China. We could have just as easily applied it to Israel. We could have just as easily applied it to our dear Muslim brothers. We could indeed apply the law of lawlessness to every community on the planet this day, because we've become so corrupt and so lawless that the earth itself has become sick, and thus we speak of climate change in this era of lawlessness. Now, in moving beyond the topic of lawlessness, we look to our second topic for the evening, which is very engaging and intriguing, and it relates to the future value of money and compound interest. And we start off with a small example. In this example, it says, Ricardo has a deli shop in Brazil and needs a very small loan of some 100 lumi to do some minor renovations. Kosi has an investment firm in South Africa and agrees to lend him the money at a rate of 5%, compounded annually over 2 years. Now, in this example, we come to understand that Kosi's money has two fundamentally different values. It has its present value and its future value. Now, most of you don't think about money in terms of its present value and future value, but indeed, as financial engineers and in a world of lawlessness, we always think of present value and future value of money. And so we ask the question, what is the present value of Kosi's money? Well, the present value is the 100 lumi that he has. And then what is the future value of Kosi's money? Although we said that he's taking the loan for 2 years, let's first look at the future value of Kosi's money after 1 year. So future value, which is reflected in the first year as FV1, equals 100 lumi times 5% interest. And so in the first year, or after rather the first year, the future value of Kosi's money is 105 lumi. Now, in the second year, we recognize that the new present value has increased from 100 to 105. And consequently, not only is the interest rate applied to the $100, but it's also applied to the $5 that he earned in the first year. And this is what we call compounding interest. And so consequently, in our equation here, we see that the new present value is 105 lumi. And the future value in year number 2 is, of course, the 105 times 5% interest. So the future value in year 2 is 110 lumi and 25 cents. And of course, we say that, note that the lumi's 5.25 interest earned in the second year is 5% of the amount at the beginning of year 2. And indeed, this is what we call compound interest. Consider for a moment at a rate of 5%, so that we can appreciate the love of interest within the market. Consider that if Kosi's 100 lumi were invested today, that its value after 100 years, if compounded annually at 5%, would be 13,150 lumis, just for having it sit there and compounding interest. Now, to understand the implications of interest and how a slight increase in interest can have such a profound change on the amount of money to be paid, consider that that same 100 lumi, rather than being compounded at 5% interest for 100 years and having a value of 13,150, imagine it is now compounded at 13%. If you compound 100 lumi at 13% for that same time period, the value comes out to be 20 million lumi. 20 million lumi. Now, for those of you who are thinking from the investor's perspective, obviously you would say, well, if you could ever find such an investment, and if you could make that investment for future generations, it would be a great return. But of course, one must always consider the reality that in exchange for someone borrowing 100 lumi, you would expect to get back 20 million lumi. Now, the reason why we talk about future values in the first place is because economists and financial engineers alike are very much aware of the fact that inflation exists in the economy. And inflation is, for all intents and purposes, a major source of tax for the government. For by deflating the purchasing power of the consumer, the government is able to reap that return. So every economist calculates inflation. And it is through that calculation of inflation that we're able to speak about the future value of money. And it is why they integrate compounding interest into their equations. Now, from a perspective of law and lawlessness, we should always be aware of the fact that the charging of interest, which in ancient days they called usury, is among the most controversial themes in the history of money lending. And I would reserve that for another discussion in another masterclass lecture. Today, we looked at lawlessness, and we did what every good financial engineer does, and we followed it through its logical implications. We followed it through its political dynamics with King James, as well as its religious dynamics. One of the facts that we must come to terms with as financial engineers, as we begin to audit our economies, is to reconcile fact from fiction, truth from deception, the law from lawlessness. One would comfortably say, if we were to consider the example of the last 400 years, and we don't say these things begrudgingly, for all education is for the edifying of our minds. And so if we understand that Moses was once able to rebuke God when the Creator said that he wanted to destroy the house of Israel, then we must understand that all of our leaders, when necessary, must be rebuked. And if our economies are running in a state of lawlessness, we shouldn't find ourselves running behind poor decisions and endorsing poor decisions, lawless decisions, simply because we are too lazy to make the correct decisions. If the example set by King James is an example of how to live the life of Christ, then who in their right mind would want to live the life of Christ? You see, that is where lawlessness brings us. You see, if the badge of the Queen is an image of an angel standing on the devil, and he's represented as a black man, then as black men, does it not mean that we ourselves, shall I not say that I myself am the devil? From the moment that we have these poor standards, these lawless standards, we bring ourselves onto a slippery slope of poor decision-making, poor economics, poor politics, and ultimately a poor society. As the diaspora, as the sixth region comes forth and begins to re-enjoin our family on the continent, we see that the Lumi, and for those of you who have received it, and for those governments who we've contracted with, no investment with the Lumi is bearing interest. The diaspora doesn't come as lenders of money looking for interest. The diaspora comes as partners, as brothers, brothers in blood and brothers in spirit, bringing a monetary instrument where we stand equally at risk with all of those who use it. There is no interest. There is no usury involved. And so as we begin to remold our economy and prepare ourselves for the great transformation that we've already begun and that will be accelerated going forward, we must be non-apologetic about the decisions we make. And if our leaders are trying to perpetuate a condition of lawlessness, then we have to make it abundantly clear to them that we wouldn't follow that path. This is the time of the audit. And as financial engineers, we want our books to be properly balanced. We can't read and tolerate statements like 2 + 2 = 17, which is the equations that institutions who look at Africa's wealth, such as the IMF and the World Bank, would have us to believe in saying that Africa is poor, when indeed it is the wealthiest continent on the planet. And our capital is more abundant than everyone else. And consequently, there is no reason for a state of poverty. And there is no reason for us to be beggars knocking on anyone's door. And so in that light and in that spirit, I bid you all a blessed evening. I normally would take questions at the close, but I have an important meeting that I must partake in. So I would request kindly that you forward any questions in writing, and I will do my best to address as many of them as possible. Until we see ourselves again next week, peace and blessings to you all. Thank you and good night.
Blessings.